Have you ever witnessed a moment so unjust that it made you question how people in positions of authority treat others? What if the person being mocked was someone who had already faced life's toughest challenges and conquered them? On a sunny afternoon in a busy town square, people went about their day, shoppers browsing storefronts, children laughing, and street performers entertaining a small crowd. The atmosphere was lively, with a sense of everyday normalcy hanging in the air. Among the bustle, a man in a wheelchair rolled slowly down the pavement. He moved with quiet determination, his face calm and composed, yet there was an unspoken strength in his eyes. To most, he seemed like just another passerby, a man carrying on with his life despite the visible limitations of his body. Little did anyone know, this wasn't just any man. He was someone whose story could inspire millions, someone who had transformed unimaginable pain into incredible triumph. But for now, his identity remained hidden. As the man navigated the street, an unexpected interaction began to unfold, one that would leave everyone watching in stunned silence. A uniformed police officer stepped forward, his posture commanding attention. What happened next would not only expose the officer's true character but also unveil the extraordinary resilience of the man he chose to ridicule. Stick with us until the end of this video to uncover the inspiring twist that left an entire crowd speechless and delivered a lesson no one would forget. The man in the wheelchair continued down the street, navigating around bustling shoppers and an uneven pavement with practiced ease. His movements were steady, almost rhythmic, as if every push of his wheels carried the weight of years of perseverance. His clothes were simple but neat, and his demeanor radiated quiet confidence. He approached a small plaza where people gathered around a street performer playing an upbeat tune on his guitar. A few kids danced to the music, and a couple of passers-by tossed coins into the performer's open case. The man paused near the edge of the crowd, positioning himself just out of the way. He didn't want to disturb anyone, just to enjoy the music for a moment. Despite his calm presence, he began to draw subtle glances. Some people smiled politely, others seemed curious, but most quickly returned to their business. To them, he was just another person passing through, someone they'd likely forget as soon as they walked away. But not everyone looked at him kindly. The officer, standing nearby, took note of the man's wheelchair and demeanor. With a glance that lingered too long, he made his way toward the man. At first, his approach seemed routine, almost casual, but there was a glint in his eye that hinted at something more. The officer didn't know who this man was. To him, he was just another disabled individual, another face in the crowd, an easy target for a misplaced joke or a condescending comment. What he didn't realize was that this moment, and the words he was about to say, would change everything. The tension was building, though the man in the wheelchair remained calm. He looked at the officer approaching, his face unreadable. In that moment, the stage was set for an encounter that no one, least of all the officer, was prepared for. The officer's footsteps were firm and deliberate as he approached the man in the wheelchair. His uniform was crisp, his badge glinting in the sunlight. He exuded an air of authority, the kind that often comes with years on the job and a certain perception of power. But beneath his composed exterior was an arrogance that occasionally surfaced in subtle ways, especially when he thought no one important was watching. He stopped a few feet away from the man, his eyes scanning him up and down. There was a moment of silence, as if he were deciding how to engage. Then, with a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, the officer broke the quiet. Well, he said, loud enough for nearby people to hear. Looks like someone's out for a little joyride today. A few heads turned, some out of curiosity, others out of discomfort. The man in the wheelchair didn't react immediately. He sat still, his hands resting on the wheels, his expression calm. The officer took the lack of response as an invitation to continue. Must be nice, the officer added, his tone dripping with mockery. No traffic to deal with, no parking tickets, just rolling around, taking it easy. The smirk grew wider, but the laughter he seemed to expect from the onlookers never came. Instead, there was an awkward silence. A few people exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. The man in the wheelchair finally looked up, meeting the officer's gaze. His expression remained composed, but his eyes seemed to hold a quiet strength, a depth that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd encountered someone like this. I'm just here like everyone else, the man said simply, his voice steady and even, enjoying the day. But the officer wasn't done. Perhaps he felt challenged by the man's calm response, or perhaps he simply didn't know when to stop. Enjoying the day? "Oh, guess you've got plenty of time for that." He chuckled, as if he'd made a clever joke. The tension in the air grew thicker. Some bystanders began to inch closer, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. They didn't know who this man was, but something about the officer's behavior didn't sit right. And though the man in the wheelchair had yet to reveal his identity, there was an undeniable presence about him, a sense that he wasn't just another passerby. What the officer didn't realize was that he was standing on the edge of a moment that would soon unravel his confidence and reveal just how wrong his assumptions were. The officer, emboldened by the lack of immediate pushback, leaned slightly closer to the man in the wheelchair. His smirk hadn't faded, and his tone grew more casual, almost as if he were teasing an old friend. But there was nothing friendly about his words. "So, what's the story?" he asked, his voice carrying a thin veneer of mock curiosity. "Had a little accident, took a wrong turn somewhere." A ripple of unease spread through the small crowd that had begun to form. People weren't sure if they should intervene or just wait to see what happened next. The man in the wheelchair didn't flinch, didn't look away. He sat with the same quiet poise, his hands steady on the wheels. "I'd rather not talk about that," the man replied, his voice calm but firm. The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, come on," he pressed. "No need to be shy. You're out here. People are going to ask questions. Might as well give them something to talk about." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the officer's words. Then he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "Maybe people should learn not to judge a story by its cover." For a brief moment, the officer hesitated. It wasn't the answer he'd expected, and it threw him off just enough for a flicker of doubt to cross his face. But he quickly recovered, doubling down instead of backing off. "Judging? Who's judging?" he said, his smirk returning. "I'm just making conversation. It's not every day you see someone rolling around like you own the place." This time, the crowd's discomfort was more evident. A woman standing nearby folded her arms, her brows furrowed. A man with a smartphone raised it discreetly, capturing the exchange. Whispers started to ripple through the group, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second. The man in the wheelchair took a slow breath, his composure unshaken. "I don't own the place," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to command attention. "But I have every right to be here just like you, just like everyone else." The officer's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't let it show for long. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, someone in the crowd muttered loudly enough to be heard, "Does he even know who that is?" The words hung in the air, and the officer froze, his expression shifting ever so slightly. For the first time, a shadow of uncertainty crept into his confident demeanor. The man in the wheelchair remained silent, but the look in his eyes hinted at something more, a quiet strength that spoke volumes without saying a word. And just like that, the balance of power in the conversation began to shift. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and the officer's confident posture began to waver. He glanced around, realizing that the mood had shifted. The mocking smirk he wore moments ago now looked out of place, almost forced. But the man in the wheelchair remained composed, his calm presence a stark contrast to the tension building around him. "You know," the man said, his voice steady but now tinged with a subtle edge, "people often reveal a lot about themselves by how they treat others." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. The crowd, sensing the significance of the moment, fell silent. All eyes were now fixed on the two men, the air charged with anticipation. The officer's expression hardened, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his face. "Hey, I was just joking," he said, his tone more cautious now. "No harm meant. You don't need to get all philosophical on me." The man tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with an air of patience. "Jokes can be powerful," he replied. "They can build people up or tear them down. It's a choice we all make." The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond. His bravado, once so bold, was starting to crack under the weight of the man's calm yet unyielding demeanor. The murmurs in the crowd resumed, growing louder as people whispered to one another. Someone pulled out their phone and began scrolling furiously, trying to confirm a suspicion that was rapidly spreading. The man in the wheelchair noticed the shift but remained focused on the officer. "I don't need an apology," the man said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "But I do hope you'll think about the example you're setting for everyone watching." The officer opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The crowd was no longer just observing. They were scrutinizing him, their collective gaze weighing heavily on his shoulders. All eyes turned toward the speaker, a young man holding up his phone, his face lit with recognition. "He's not just anyone," the young man said, his voice filled with awe. "That's insert athlete's name, the Paralympic champion." For the first time, the officer truly understood the gravity of his actions, but it was too late to undo what had been said. The moment had already become something much bigger than either of them. The revelation hit like a shockwave. A Paralympic champion, someone in the crowd echoed, their voice tinged with disbelief and admiration. Whispers turned into exclamations as people scrambled to recall the man's accomplishments. "He's the one who broke the record last year. Didn't he win gold after his accident?" The officer's confidence, already fragile, now teetered on the edge of collapse. His face flushed as he realized the weight of his mistake. He glanced around at the crowd, which had grown noticeably larger, their gazes filled with judgment. The shift in power was undeniable, but instead of retreating, the officer doubled down, perhaps out of pride or sheer desperation to regain control of the situation. "Look," he said, his voice louder than before, as if trying to drown out the murmurs. "I didn't know who you were. It's not like you've got a sign on your back or anything." The man in the wheelchair raised an eyebrow, his calm exterior unshaken. "You're right," he replied. "You didn't know who I was. But does that make it okay to treat me or anyone like less than human?" The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement, their growing support emboldening the man. The officer's face tightened, his discomfort now visible to everyone. He took a step back, but his defensive tone remained. "I didn't mean any harm," he muttered, though his words sounded hollow. "That's the thing about harm," the man said, his voice steady but cutting through the noise like a blade. "It doesn't depend on your intentions, it depends on your actions." The crowd, now fully on the man's side, began to voice their opinions openly. "Show some respect," someone shouted. "You can't talk to people like that," added another. Phones were now out in full force, capturing every word, every reaction. The officer's defensiveness gave way to visible discomfort. He looked around, realizing there was no escape from the scrutiny. All right," he said, raising his hands as if to calm the crowd. "I made a mistake. Okay, let's not blow this out of proportion." But the man in the wheelchair wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto the officers. "This isn't about proportions," he said. "It's about accountability. And it's about respect, something everyone deserves, regardless of who they are." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the plaza. The officer, now visibly flustered, looked around helplessly, his earlier bravado completely gone. The tables had turned, and the moment was no longer his to control. The man sat back in his wheelchair, his calm composure unbroken, as the crowd rallied behind him. The tension had reached its peak, and the officer, now fully aware of the gravity of his actions, stood in stunned silence. This wasn't just an exchange anymore. It was a moment of reckoning. The applause subsided, but the energy in the plaza remained electric. All eyes were on the man in the wheelchair, their admiration and curiosity palpable. People in the crowd began murmuring details of his story, piecing together the incredible journey that had led him to this moment. "That's him," one woman whispered to her friend. "The guy who lost his leg in that car crash and still came back to win gold. Remember the Paralympics last year?" Another voice chimed in, louder this time. "He's a national hero. How could anyone not know who he is?" The officer's face turned ashen as the reality of the situation fully hit him. He wasn't just dealing with an ordinary citizen, he had mocked a man who had overcome unimaginable challenges, a man whose achievements were celebrated around the world. And now, the crowd was making sure he knew it. The young man who had first recognized the athlete stepped forward, his phone in hand. "You're insert athlete's name, aren't you?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "The one who won the 100-meter dash in record time. You're a legend, man." The man in the wheelchair gave a small nod, his expression modest. "That's me," he said simply. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause again, this time louder than before. People called out his name, their voices filled with admiration and respect. The officer, now visibly sweating, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the crowd's judgment. But the man in the wheelchair wasn't basking in the adulation. He raised a hand, signaling for the crowd to quiet down. When the noise subsided, he turned his attention back to the officer. "Does it matter who I am?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. "Would it have made a difference if I weren't an athlete? If I were just an ordinary person, would I have deserved less respect?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but quickly shut it again, unable to find the right words. The crowd watched, their silence heavy with expectation. "That's the real question," the man continued, his voice carrying across the plaza. "Respect shouldn't depend on someone's achievements or fame. It should be a given for everyone." The crowd broke into applause once more, their cheers now mixed with nods of agreement and murmurs of approval. The officer's shoulders slumped, his earlier arrogance completely drained. He looked at the man in the wheelchair, his expression a mixture of regret and shame. In that moment, it was clear to everyone that this was no longer just about one man or one incident. It was about something much bigger, a lesson in humility, equality, and the power of dignity. And the man in the wheelchair had delivered it with grace and strength, leaving everyone, including the officer, with something to think about. The weight of the man's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the plaza was silent except for the occasional rustle of movement in the crowd. The officer, now fully aware of how far he'd overstepped, cleared his throat awkwardly. He looked down, then back at the man in the wheelchair, his face a mix of embarrassment and guilt. "You're right," the officer said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I messed up. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I didn't treat you or anyone the way I should have." The crowd murmured, some nodding at his attempt to own up to his behavior, others still skeptical. All eyes remained on the man in the wheelchair, waiting to see how he would respond. The man studied the officer for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he said, "Acknowledging a mistake is the first step, but what matters most is what you do next." The officer nodded quickly, his discomfort evident. "I'll do better," he said, his voice gaining strength as if convincing himself as much as anyone else. "I'll think before I speak, and I'll treat everyone with the respect they deserve." A few claps broke out from the crowd, and though they weren't as loud as before, they carried a sense of cautious approval. The man in the wheelchair gave a small smile, his composure still unshaken. "I hope you mean that," he said, "because respect isn't just about words, it's about actions." The officer nodded again, more earnestly this time. "I do," he said, "and I'm sorry for what I said and for the way I acted." The man paused, letting the words settle. Then he extended his hand, a gesture of reconciliation. The officer hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and shook it, his grip firm but careful, as if trying to convey his sincerity through the gesture. The crowd erupted into applause once more, their cheers carrying a mix of relief and admiration. The moment felt lighter now, as though the tension that had filled the air earlier had finally lifted. But even as the applause rang out, the man in the wheelchair turned to address the crowd. "Let this be a reminder for all of us," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "We don't know what battles others are fighting. Kindness and respect should always be our first response." The crowd cheered louder, their admiration for the man reaching new heights. The officer stepped back, his expression thoughtful as if reflecting on the lesson he'd just learned. For a brief moment, the plaza felt united not just by the man's words, but by the powerful reminder of the dignity that every person deserves. As the man in the wheelchair finished speaking, the applause swelled, rippling through the crowd like a wave. People exchanged looks of admiration and respect, their faces lit with a newfound sense of unity. Strangers who had been mere bystanders moments ago were now nodding at each other, as if silently agreeing to carry the lesson forward. A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, her voice breaking the momentary hush. "Thank you for saying that," she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "It's something we all need to hear, especially now." Others chimed in, their voices a mix of gratitude and self-reflection. "You've inspired us," an older man said, tipping his hat in respect. "Not just because of what you've accomplished, but because of the way you handled this." The man in the wheelchair acknowledged their words with a humble nod, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "I appreciate that," he said, "but it's not just about me. It's about all of us choosing to see the humanity in each other, every single day." From the back of the crowd, a young boy's voice piped up, cutting through the chatter. "You're a hero," he shouted, his words pure and unfiltered. Laughter and cheers erupted as people turned to smile at the boy, whose innocent declaration seemed to sum up what everyone was feeling. The man in the wheelchair gave the boy a warm smile. "Thank you," he said, "but heroes come in all forms. Sometimes, being a hero just means standing up for what's right or choosing kindness when it's easier not to." The crowd's applause returned, louder this time, filled with genuine admiration. Some people began snapping pictures, while others recorded videos, determined to capture the moment and share it with the world. The officer, standing quietly to the side, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and introspection. His earlier embarrassment had given way to a look of deep thought, as if the man's words had planted a seed that was beginning to take root. As the applause died down, someone in the crowd asked, "What's next for you?" "Another race, another record to break." The man smiled, his expression lightening for the first time. "I'm always chasing the next goal," he said, "but right now, I think the most important race is the one we're all in together, the race to be better, kinder, and more understanding." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, their voices echoing through the plaza. It wasn't just applause for the man in the wheelchair, it was applause for the idea he represented, a reminder of the values they all aspired to uphold. In that moment, the man wasn't just a Paralympic champion, he was a symbol of resilience, dignity, and the power of compassion. And everyone in the plaza left feeling just a little more inspired than they had been before. As the crowd continued to cheer and celebrate, the officer remained at the edge of the plaza, his gaze fixed on the man in the wheelchair. The moment of realization had hit him harder than he expected. His earlier actions, his mocking tone, the way he had assumed his authority over someone without even knowing who they were, it all felt so wrong now. The weight of the lesson was still sinking in, but the officer knew he couldn't let this moment pass without taking responsibility. He took a deep breath, his eyes shifting to the man who had just taught him more about respect and humanity than he'd learned it in years of service. The officer made his way toward him, each step heavier than the last. The crowd noticed the officer's approach and fell into a hushed silence, unsure of what would happen next. The man in the wheelchair, sensing the officer's presence, turned to face him. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness, just calm understanding. The officer stopped in front of him, his shoulders slightly hunched. He swallowed hard before speaking. "I want to apologize again," he said, his voice quieter than before, almost vulnerable. "I made a huge mistake today. I disrespected you, and I disrespected everyone here." The man in the wheelchair met his gaze without hesitation. "Apology accepted," he said simply, "but it's not just about saying sorry. It's about showing that you've learned something from it." The officer nodded, taking the man's words to heart. "I know, and I will. I'll do better." For a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet recognition that, though the officer had been wrong, he was willing to change. The crowd, watching the exchange, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next step. The man in the wheelchair gave a slight smile, a gesture of forgiveness that spoke volumes. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is how we rise from them, and I can see that you're trying to." The officer, visibly relieved, straightened his posture. I promise. Thank you for your patience." With that, the officer turned and began to walk away, but not before looking back one last time. The man in the wheelchair, still seated calmly, nodded in acknowledgement. The officer gave a small wave before disappearing into the crowd, a little lighter than he had been when he arrived. The crowd, sensing the closure of the moment, began to disperse, though their energy had shifted. They weren't just walking away from a confrontation. They were walking away from a lesson, a reminder of the importance of respect, humility, and the ability to change. The man in the wheelchair, now alone at the center of the plaza, surveyed the scene around him. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. He had stood up not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged or underestimated. And in doing so, he had made the world just a little bit better. As he wheeled himself away from the plaza, a sense of quiet pride settled over him. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for all those who had ever felt invisible. And that was worth more than any medal he had ever earned. As the man in the wheelchair rolled away from the plaza, he didn't look back. The crowd had dispersed, but the atmosphere was still thick with reflection. People walked with a new awareness, their steps slower, their thoughts deeper. It wasn't just the man's story that had resonated with them, it was the change in how they saw the world around them. The officer, too, walked away, but his mind was spinning. His usual routine had been interrupted, his assumptions shattered. The exchange had forced him to look inward, to confront his own biases and preconceived notions. He had learned a hard lesson, but it was one that would stay with him. Later that evening, in the privacy of his home, the officer sat quietly, his thoughts consumed by the day's events. He pulled up his phone and began scrolling through the videos of the encounter. He watched as the man in the wheelchair had stood his ground with calm dignity, and as the crowd had rallied behind him. The officer couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for the athlete, not just for his achievements, but for the way he had handled the situation. "I can do better," he whispered to himself. "I have to." Meanwhile, the man in the wheelchair, insert athlete's name, was reflecting on the day as well. He had seen the officer's apology, the sincerity in his eyes, and he knew that this encounter had made a difference, not just for the officer, but for everyone who had witnessed it. His phone buzzed, a message from a friend congratulating him for handling the situation so gracefully. He smiled and typed a quick reply, but his mind was elsewhere. "I didn't do it for the recognition," he thought, looking out of the window at the city lights. "I did it for the people who need to hear it, the ones who are still struggling to be seen, to be heard." The next morning, the story of the encounter went viral. News outlets picked up the video, and the footage spread across social media platforms. Headlines ranged from "Athlete teaches officer a lesson in respect" to "How one Paralympian changed the way we see each other." But the man in the wheelchair didn't care about the headlines. What mattered was that people were talking. They were talking about respect, kindness, and the importance of seeing each other as equals. He knew that change, real change, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, everyday moments when people chose to act with dignity. The officer, too, began to notice the ripple effects of that day. He received messages from colleagues and even strangers, some praising him for his apology, others reminding him that true change came with consistent effort. He took it all in stride, determined to live up to the promise he had made to himself and to the crowd. For both men, that day marked a turning point. It was the day they realized that the world didn't just need more heroes, it needed more people who were willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. It needed people who understood that respect was something earned every single day, not just through accolades or titles, but through how they treated others. As the days went on, both the athlete and the officer continued their lives, but the impact of that moment remained with them. And though their paths would likely never cross again, they would carry the lessons learned in that brief, powerful encounter. The world, it seemed, had been reminded of something important: kindness, respect, and humility could change everything, even in the most unexpected places. Months passed, but the memory of that day continued to echo in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. The video of the encounter went viral, sparking conversations about empathy, understanding, and the power of standing up for others. News outlets and social media users alike continued to share the footage, using it as a catalyst for change in their own communities. The man in the wheelchair, now a symbol of grace under pressure, received countless messages from people all over the world. Some thanked him for inspiring them to be kinder, others for helping them to see the world in a new light. He didn't always respond, but each message was a reminder of the profound impact one person's actions could have. One evening, a mother of a young child with a disability sent him a heartfelt message: "My son watched your video today, and for the first time, he felt proud of who he is. He said he wanted to be like you when he grows up." The athlete smiled as he read the message, a quiet sense of fulfillment settling in his heart. He had always believed in the power of representation, but now he saw at firsthand the ripple effect of one moment, one act of kindness, spreading across generations. Meanwhile, the officer, now more aware of his own actions, had started making small but significant changes in his approach to policing. He attended workshops on bias and inclusivity, determined to ensure that he never again made someone feel the way he had made the athlete feel that day. He spoke openly about his mistake in conversations with colleagues, encouraging others to reflect on their own behavior. His newfound awareness was tested one day when he responded to a call involving a group of teenagers. One of them, a young boy with a visible disability, was being questioned by another officer in a manner that made the officer uncomfortable. Without thinking, he stepped in, gently correcting his colleague and reminding him of the importance of respect in every interaction. The young boy, noticing the officer's kindness, smiled and thanked him. For the officer, that moment was a reminder that change wasn't just about big gestures, it was about making better choices, day after day. Back in the plaza where the confrontation had occurred, a small plaque was placed in the center. It read, Respect is the foundation of every community. Let us treat each other with dignity, no matter our differences. It was a tribute to the day when one man's courage had sparked a conversation that changed a community. Over time, the story of the encounter became a part of local lore. Teachers used it in classrooms to teach students about empathy and respect. Community leaders referenced it in speeches, and people shared it during discussions about how to create more inclusive environments. The lesson, it seemed, was one that continued to resonate with everyone who heard it. And as for the man in the wheelchair, he continued his journey, pursuing new goals and breaking new records, but always carrying with him the memory of that powerful moment. He knew that no matter how many medals or accolades he earned, the true victory was in the everyday moments, those small acts of courage and kindness that could change someone's life. The officer, too, carried the lesson forward, never forgetting the impact of one simple encounter. He knew that respect was earned, not just through apologies, but through consistent actions. Together, their lives had intersected in a way neither of them had anticipated, but the legacy of that day was something neither of them would ever forget. It was a reminder that we all have the power to change the world, one moment, one choice at a time. And so, the ripple effect of that powerful exchange continued, spreading far beyond the plaza, creating a legacy that would last for generations to come. The story of the man in the wheelchair and the officer didn't just stay in their local community. It became a global symbol for kindness, respect, and the importance of confronting our biases. People across the world shared the video, not just because it was powerful, but because it reminded them of something they often overlook: the human connection we all share, no matter our backgrounds, abilities, or experiences. The story began to circulate in different countries, translated into multiple languages, and featured in news outlets worldwide. Schools, workplaces, and social organizations began using it as a teaching tool to start conversations about inclusivity and understanding. In many ways, the moment between the athlete and the officer became a cornerstone for a global movement, a movement built on mutual respect and the idea that everyone deserves dignity. Social media hashtags like #RespectForAll, #KindnessInAction, and #seeing each other began trending. People from all walks of life posted their own stories of kindness, and many shared how the video had impacted their perspective on how they interacted with others. One day, a viral post appeared from a young woman in Japan who had recently attended a local workshop on disability awareness. In her post, she wrote, "I watched the video of the athlete and the officer, and it changed how I think about the world. I've realized that I've taken many things for granted. We all have something to learn from each other." The post sparked hundreds of comments from people across the globe who shared similar experiences of reevaluating their attitudes and actions. Some expressed regret for moments in their own lives when they hadn't shown respect, while others offered heartfelt messages of support and solidarity. The athlete, overwhelmed by the impact of the movement, posted a message of his own on social media. "Thank you for making this moment bigger than any medal or record. I'm humbled by how this story has brought us all together. Let's keep spreading respect and kindness wherever we go." His message was met with thousands of comments, likes, and shares, creating a ripple effect that stretched far beyond the confines of the original incident. People from all corners of the world were joining the conversation, with many committing to practice empathy and understanding in their daily lives. In response to the growing movement, a global nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting inclusion and respect was formed. It was founded by a group of individuals who had been inspired by the encounter, including educators, activists, and members of the disabled community. Their mission was clear: to continue the conversation about respect, to raise awareness about biases, and to create a world where everyone, regardless of their abilities or background, could live with dignity. The organization launched several initiatives, including workshops, campaigns, and social media challenges designed to encourage people to reflect on their behavior and embrace inclusivity. Schools began incorporating lessons on empathy into their curricula, and businesses started offering training on how to create more inclusive environments. But the most powerful aspect of the movement was the simple, everyday actions that people took. A stranger helping someone with a disability across the street, a teacher taking extra time to make sure every student felt heard, a neighbor checking in on someone they hadn't spoken to in years. All of these small moments of kindness were part of the larger wave of change. Even the officer, now deeply involved in his community's efforts to promote inclusivity, continued to be an active participant in the movement. He spoke at local schools and participated in workshops about how to recognize and overcome biases in policing. He often referenced his own journey, how one single mistake had led him to rethink his entire approach to respect and kindness. As for the man in the wheelchair, his role in the movement became more than just that of a symbol. He became a leader, using his platform to advocate for people with disabilities, pushing for better representation and more opportunities for those who had been marginalized. He traveled the world, speaking at conferences and sharing his story with others. But no matter where he went, he always returned to the core message that had started it all. Respect isn't just a word, he would say in his speeches. It's a way of life. It's about recognizing each other's humanity, no matter where we come from, what we look like, or what challenges we face. The legacy of that single encounter between an athlete and an officer continued to grow, becoming a global movement that brought people together, united in their desire for a more inclusive, kind, and respectful world. It proved that no matter where you were, or what your story was, one moment could change everything. And together, people could create a world where everyone was seen, heard, and valued. As the years passed, the movement sparked by that single encounter between the man in the wheelchair and the officer evolved into something much larger than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just a moment in time, it had become a fundamental shift in how society viewed respect, dignity, and the importance of empathy. The global conversation about inclusion continued to thrive, and the ripple effects were felt in every corner of the world. In cities and towns, large and small, people now routinely engaged in conversations about their biases, actively challenging themselves to make better choices in their everyday interactions. Employers adopted policies that promoted inclusivity, and communities began to prioritize accessibility, ensuring that people of all abilities were not only included but celebrated. Schools that had embraced the lessons from the encounter created programs where students, regardless of their background, worked together to solve problems, fostering collaboration and understanding from an early age. The impact was clear. The next generation was growing up with a stronger sense of empathy, knowing that kindness and respect were the keys to building a better world. The athlete, whose story had been the catalyst for this transformation, continued to break records and achieve new heights in his sport. But his greatest legacy wasn't the medals or the accolades, it was the change he had ignited in the hearts of millions. As he traveled the world, he spoke not only about his journey as an athlete but also about his journey as a human being, someone who had learned that true strength was not just about physical endurance, but about standing up for others, showing compassion, and using one's platform for good. One afternoon, at a global conference on human rights and disability awareness, the man in the wheelchair addressed an audience of leaders, activists, and advocates. His words were more powerful than ever, as he shared the impact of the movement that had started with his encounter with the officer. "We've come so far," he said, his voice resonating with both pride and humility. "But the work is far from over. We've created a world where respect and inclusion are no longer just ideals, we've made them a reality. And yet, we must continue to push forward, to make sure that no one is ever left behind. We are all part of this journey." The crowd responded with a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the auditorium. It was clear that the impact of his message had resonated deeply, inspiring countless others to continue the work of building a more just and inclusive world. Meanwhile, the officer, who had once been at the center of the controversy, had also become an advocate for change. His story of personal growth had inspired many of his colleagues in law enforcement to reassess their own actions and approaches to policing. He had helped lead training programs on recognizing unconscious bias and promoting empathy in police work. One day, while attending a community meeting, the officer was approached by a young man who had heard his story. The young man, whose father had once been a police officer, thanked him for his efforts to make policing more compassionate. "You've shown us that we can be strong without losing our humanity," he said. The officer, moved by the young man's words, smiled. "It's not about being perfect," he replied. "It's about doing better every day and learning from each other." As time went on, the movement continued to evolve. The world had changed, but the principles that had been set in motion remained the same. The idea that every person deserved respect, no matter their circumstances, had taken root deeply in society. People had begun to recognize the power of kindness, not as a weakness, but as a strength that could change the world. The story of the athlete and the officer remained a powerful reminder that one small act of courage could create a ripple effect that would change the course of history. It wasn't just about what they had done that day, it was about what the world had done since then, coming together to create a society that valued empathy, respect, and equality. In the years to come, when people spoke of the moment that had sparked a global movement, they would remember it as the day that a simple interaction between two individuals, one a disabled athlete and the other a police officer, had forever changed the way humanity viewed each other. The movement they had started would continue, evolving with each new generation, until the world had truly become a place where everyone was seen, heard, and valued. And as the man in the wheelchair, now older and wiser, continued to inspire, he knew that his legacy wasn't just in the lessons he had taught, but in the future he had helped shape a future where respect, kindness, and understanding would be the foundation of every community. The years had passed, and the world had changed. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of transformation anymore. The principles of respect, empathy, and inclusion had woven themselves into the very fabric of society. What had started with a single, powerful interaction between a man in a wheelchair and a police officer had evolved into a lasting movement that continued to grow, inspiring people from all walks of life. The global movement was no longer just about one athlete's experience or one officer's apology. It had become a universal message that transcended boundaries, connecting people across continents, cultures, and communities. It was a movement grounded in the belief that empathy wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity for building a better world. Now, as the movement matured, it had found its place in education, law, politics, and even entertainment. Media outlets produced documentaries and films highlighting stories of individuals who had used their platform to advocate for kindness and inclusivity. Stories of marginalized communities, those often silenced or overlooked, were now being heard loud and clear. And it was through these stories that society learned to see each other not as strangers, but as people with shared humanity. At a prestigious global summit, leaders from around the world gathered to discuss the future of inclusion. The man in the wheelchair, now recognized as one of the leading advocates for disability rights, took the stage once again. His words were measured, yet filled with passion, as he addressed an audience that had come to listen not just to a leader, but to a living testament of the change he had sparked. "We've built something extraordinary together," he began, his voice carrying the weight of years of effort and growth. "But the journey doesn't end here. We're not finished until every person, no matter their ability, their background, or their identity, feels truly seen and heard. We're building a world where respect isn't the exception, it's the rule." The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't just the applause of admiration, it was the sound of a collective commitment to continue pushing for progress. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't just the applause of admiration, it was the sound of a collective commitment to continue pushing for progress. Back in the communities where it had all started, the effects were clear. In schools, young students were growing up with a deeper understanding of their peers. Children with disabilities were no longer isolated or overlooked. Teachers worked alongside parents and community leaders to ensure that every child, regardless of their circumstances, had the opportunity to thrive. In workplaces, inclusivity wasn't just a checkbox, it was embedded in the culture. Employers were actively seeking diverse perspectives, recognizing that a team built on empathy and mutual respect was a stronger, more innovative team. The officer, who had once been the embodiment of misplaced authority, had become a beacon for positive change in his department, regularly working with colleagues to implement policies that focused on de-escalation, community engagement, and respect for all citizens. Even the media had embraced the change. News outlets now consistently featured stories that highlighted the successes of individuals who had been marginalized in the past. From athletes with disabilities to underrepresented communities in politics, the stories of those who had been silenced were now given the platform they deserved. The officer, now retired from active duty, had become a community advocate, frequently speaking at events about the importance of emotional intelligence in law enforcement. His own journey from a moment of mockery to a lifetime of learning had become a powerful story that inspired countless others to take a hard look at their own actions and assumptions. He spoke of the day he met the athlete, the lesson that had forever changed his approach to policing, and how that single moment had set him on a path of personal growth. "I was wrong that day," he often said in his speeches, "but I learned, and that's what matters." It's not about never making mistakes. It's about how we rise from them. And as for the athlete, his life continued to be a beacon of strength, resilience, and compassion. He had become a global ambassador for not only disability rights but for human rights as a whole. His advocacy work had taken him to the highest levels of government, where he was consulted on policy changes aimed at making the world more inclusive. But no matter where he went, he remained grounded in the same belief that had driven him from the start: the idea that every person, regardless of their challenges, had the right to be treated with dignity. In a quiet moment, as he sat reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, he thought back to the day when the officer had first approached him in the plaza. It had been a simple act, an apology, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it had sparked something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. It had sparked a movement that would last for generations, one built on the foundation of empathy and respect. He smiled, knowing that the world was now a little bit closer to the vision he had always hoped for: a world where kindness and understanding were the default, where everyone was truly seen and valued. The legacy of that day, of that simple interaction between two people from very different worlds, would continue to shape the future. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, willing to challenge their assumptions, and willing to listen, the movement would never stop. Because, as the athlete often said in his speeches, the real power is in how we treat each other every single day. That's where change begins. And with that, the world moved forward, one act of kindness, one moment of empathy, and one person at a time. If you enjoyed this powerful story of transformation and hope, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support helps us spread messages of empathy and inclusion to a wider audience. Also, hit the bell icon so you never miss out on our latest content. Together, we can continue to change the world, one kind act at a time. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.